Welcome, coaches, to the final session of the NABC Fall Summit. I hope you've benefited from the programming over the last 3 days. It's fitting that we wrap up our event with a topic that remains front and center for all of us. How can we successfully complete a season as the COVID-19 pandemic continues? We're lucky to be joined today by Dr. Brian Hainline, the NCAA's Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Hainline has been a leading voice in developing plans for college sports return, including the NCAA's recent release of various guidelines for college basketball. I can speak from experience that Dr. Hainline is truly an advocate for coaches and wants to see the game of basketball played as much as we do. In order to help Dr. Hainline prepare for this session, we received questions from many of you prior to today that he will address shortly. But if any other questions come up, feel free to submit them in the Q&A feature and we'll work to address them in future communications. Dr. Hainline, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll just turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Craig, and welcome, coaches, and it really is an honor for me to be here with you, and especially because as I look at my life, so I played collegiate tennis. I was a scholarship athlete, but I wasn't sure what sport was going to be my sport. Basketball, I played many years of basketball, and I can just assure you that the coaches in my life have been essentially the most influential people that I know. And we know for a fact from surveys that coaches are the single most important influence of athletes. So I have such a great deal of respect for you. You're not just coaches, you're educators, you're individuals who are helping to build other people's lives. And I know I've personally experienced that gift, and anything I can do to give that back, that I almost feel that that's my duty, because it's been such a privilege for me to witness sport and to be part of sport. We're in challenging times right now. We all remember back in March of this year when we all of a sudden had to make a decision on March 11th to say that we're not going to have fans for the Final Four, and then to cancel not only the Final Four, but all of winter and spring sports. And that was during the first wave. And then a second wave came right when we were beginning to think about resocializing sports. So we were looking at the summer and the fall, and that was in the midst of what we called the second wave of this pandemic. And then that got better, and now we're entering a third wave. The one thing I can tell you is that with each successive wave, the amount of knowledge that we have gained has been phenomenal. There has never been so much information about a single pathogen or disease that has been accumulated in such a condensed period of time as with COVID-19. It makes it very challenging for us, those of us who are scientists or clinicians or public health advocates, because the information is not always completely vetted in the way that we're used to seeing peer-reviewed information, but it's really, really solid. And the way we have worked forward is to surround ourselves by experts. So many of you know that we have a NCAA COVID-19 medical advisory group. And these are individuals who are not just leading experts in infectious disease and public health, but also boots on the ground physicians, athletic trainers, and real advocates for student athletes. And in fact, we have a student athlete liaison panel that's associated with this. We meet at least once weekly, and then we probably communicate, somewhere between 5 and 10 times a day. So it's been really quite rewarding. And as you know, what we have done is we've come out with recommendations. And let me just start by explaining the difference between recommendations and mandates. So recall that during the second wave, when we were thinking of beginning summer and fall sports, and not only was there a second wave, but there was once again a considerable shortage of testing supplies in this country. And so the Board of Governors took our then resocialization document and they made it a mandate. In addition to saying that any student athlete who wanted to opt out could do so without jeopardizing his or her eligibility or scholarship. And they also mandated that there be a 24/7 hotline for individuals who felt that there was a misuse or even abuse of COVID recommendations. So that was the feeling back then. Right now, we're back in this place of recommendations. There's not been talk of making things a mandate. But recommendations are not taken lightly, because if there are recommendations, they're consensus based. And if a school says, well, we don't believe we want to follow these recommendations, actually that's fine. And in many cases, there may be local recommendations that are really quite sound. And so there may be a rationale that at a particular school, in conjunction with their general counsel and with local health officials, that they say, well, you know, this really is the best way to manage our athletes based on where we are right now. And so that certainly also is always there as a possibility. But by and large, I think the recommendations are being followed by most individuals. So we do understand that they carry some weight. And so with that, I'm going to get into the first question. We have 10 questions that were sent to me. So excuse me while I read the question, but then I'll be back looking at you. So the first question is, as you know, there has been a lot of discussion around the NCAA's recommendations for 3 COVID tests per week in season. Many conferences and institutions, they acknowledge that it'll be difficult to play anywhere near the maximum number of games. And so has there been discussion to recommend less testing per week for teams that are playing less games per week? For instance, if you're just playing 1 game per week or back-to-back games, does that make sense? So that's a great question, and we have addressed that. So first, let's talk about the 3 times a week testing. You may know that the 2 general types of tests are either the PCR test, polymerase chain reaction test, or the point of care antigen test. So what a PCR test is, it amplifies the nucleic acid, the RNA of the virus. It can amplify it 100, 1,000 times so that you can detect if there's virus particles there. The antigen test does not amplify, and it identifies a protein in the inner part of the virus. So they are very different kinds of tests. Also, for the most part, the PCR test is sent to a lab, whereas the antigen test is what's called point of care, meaning that you have the instrument right there and you can administer it right there and you get the answer right there. It doesn't go out to a lab. And so we've recommended PCR or antigen testing 3 times a week on non-consecutive days. The reason why we didn't differentiate whether you use PCR or antigen testing is because there's really reliable mathematical modeling data that if you test regularly, it doesn't matter if one test is more or less sensitive than another. What really matters is the regularity or the cadence of testing. So that's why the group was agnostic as to whether it's PCR or antigen. So we did receive numerous requests from many conferences, because what they are going to do in their schedule is do conference only games, and they're just going to do once weekly games, but often they're going to be back to back. So say Team A is going to play Team B, and it will be at just one site. So let's say it's just at Team B's site. And the games could be Thursday, Friday, or Friday, Saturday, or they could be Thursday, Saturday. So those were the considerations we looked at. We didn't go beyond that to say, well, Team A plays at Team B one night and Team B goes to Team A the next night. We actually are going to look at that coming forward. But just in that scenario, so 2 games or 1 at one site, back to back or separated by a day, we have formally recommended that in that case, one could perform 1 PCR test, and that would be done before the competition, and it would be within 3 days of the second game. So let's say that you're going to be playing Thursday, Saturday. The second game is Saturday. So that means the PCR test would be done Wednesday before that Saturday game. And we made it days rather than hours. We didn't say 72 hours because sometimes it might be 80 hours, like 3.5 days. And so we gave that wiggle room. The alternative is that you can do an antigen test, point of care antigen test, the day of each game. So if it's Thursday, Saturday, you would do an antigen test Thursday and you would do another one Saturday. And this is for the players and for those that are tier 1. So that includes the officials, and that includes the coaches, those that are really intimately involved with the players. So we did hear the membership, we heard the coaches loud and clear on that. The group considered it, and they believe that it is safe to proceed in the way that I just outlined. So thank you for that question. Here's next question is, if a player on an opposing team that we play tests positive, does it wipe out everyone that played in the game from our team? And if someone tests positive but has no symptoms, then they take multiple successive tests, and if negative, be cleared back to action. And then they put in parentheses, Coach Saban of Alabama. He's not a basketball coach. And then they say, if our team is on the road and someone in the travel party tests positive, how and when do we get them home? And for player and coaches who have previously tested positive, do they have to quarantine? So Craig, this is actually like 5 questions in one. So you said I just had 10 questions, but that just got multiplied. But all of these are good and they're interrelated. So let me explain them. So first is the tricky issue of contact tracing. What separates basketball from, say, football or even wrestling is that it's very difficult to practice and certainly to compete in pods in basketball. You have 13 to 15 players, and they're very involved and they're close to one another. Now, the NCAA does not control contact tracing. The government doesn't control contact tracing nationally. It's all decided at a local level. And so what we have recommended to our schools, and coaches, you should be very involved in making certain this has happened, is that you have an adequate number of contact tracers available who are on site, boots on the ground individuals. Now, they can be trained for free, and we've provided the courses for that. But they still report into the local public health authorities. Some local public health authorities work really, really well with these contact tracers, and others, you know, they sort of take this job differently. It's political power and muscle, and they won't work as well. So we really have stressed to the conference commissioners, to the athletic directors, develop a good working relationship with your local official. The point is, though, if Team A has someone who has tested positive, it's quite possible that Team B and the majority of Team B is going to be placed in quarantine for 14 days. That's the challenge of basketball because there's such proximity. So the CDC defines high-risk contact as 15 minutes of cumulative contact. So it could happen all at once or interspersed in 10-second intervals within 24 hours. What's even more challenging is the CDC doesn't differentiate if you wear a mask or not. Some local municipalities, they say, well, if both people were wearing a mask, it's fine, you don't have to quarantine, and others say it doesn't matter. This is a very important point. This is political. It's not just science. It's not just medicine. All contact tracing, all of the rules of engagement, they're very, very political, and they're set by either the municipality or the state. But the contact tracing, having boots on the ground, is important. I will tell you that I was one of the individuals who helped put together the US Open Tennis Championships this year. So this was the first international sport event that happened since COVID began. And it was really successful, but we had a large number of contact tracers on the ground. And when there was one player who tested positive, not from playing tennis, but from, playing cards, we had our contact tracers working it immediately because sometimes it can take up to 2 days. So that's the challenge of basketball. And then the other challenge is the quarantine. It's 14 days, which may not make sense to you because we know that if you test positive and you don't have symptoms, you're in isolation for only 10 days. Why is that? Because at least when the CDC first put out those recommendations, they felt it was really possible for you to develop an infection after exposure up to 14 days. Let me address that point and then get to the Coach Saban point. The quarantine issue is really challenging. What we have done, and we work really closely with the CDC, including their most senior infectious disease experts. We actually are in the process of doing a study with 3 or 4 schools where they have submitted their de-identified data to the CDC They have data that's phenomenal, that is from testing athletes every single day, including when they were in quarantine. The CDC is going to analyze that data, and hopefully it's going to be turned around within 2 weeks. And we believe, our hypothesis is that if you test negative on days 5, 6, and 7, that will mathematically predict that the probability of testing positive beyond that is exceptionally low. And if the CDC publishes that, that allows a protocol to test out of quarantine at 8 days. Here's the kicker though. There are already some states who have said, we don't care if you test negative on days 5, 6, and 7. We're going to mandate the quarantine for 2 weeks. Other states have said, this is great, and we will go ahead with that. So now you have competitive equity issues. So that's the challenge of quarantine. So remember, quarantine is when you're at high risk exposure. You're not having symptoms. You can still work out and train in quarantine, but you're separated from others. Let's talk about Coach Saban, what happened, and this is public information. He tested positive. He had a positive PCR test. And it was a lab that he normally hadn't used. And the question was, is this a false positive? So what does a false positive mean? It means that, say I test positive, but I actually don't have COVID. And the only way to know that is to retest. So we do have a protocol in place, the NCAA, that because false positives are more common with antigen tests, that if you have a positive antigen test, if you do a confirmatory PCR test and it's negative, that's the result. It's trickier when it's PCR. So the SEC conference had in play a recommendation that if there is a positive and you believe it might be a false positive, you can then repeat the PCR test on 3 separate occasions, separated by 24 hours. And if all 3 are negative, that will override the false positive. So that's why Coach Saban tested out, because he actually never had the infection. It was a false positive. And by the way, the NFL has had scores of false positives, and so have other conferences. So none of these tests are foolproof. That's another challenge. But here's another issue. There are some municipalities that have said, once you have a positive PCR test, that's it. You're positive. The test is not going to be repeated. We don't care. Again, politics, all things local. The NCAA can't override that. We cannot control that. This is a public health authority decision. So that's the issue with that. And then there was another question as part of this multifaceted question. What about those who have previously tested positive? So let's say there's a basketball player who tests positive this week. Well, what the CDC has recommended is that once you have tested positive, you do not need to repeat testing for the next 90 days. And then they're silent after that. They don't say what happens after 90 days. So they do say the only scenario to retest within 90 days would be if you have COVID-like symptoms that are not explained by another illness. And by the way, there have been maybe a couple of case reports of people getting COVID twice, but we think that it is so phenomenally rare as to be essentially non-existent. It just, there may be a couple of case reports, but it just is not the reality that we are seeing. So then what happens? So in that 90 days, that player doesn't need to be tested, doesn't need to be tested 3 times a week. And in those 90 days, doesn't need to be in quarantine if there's a high risk exposure. What happens after that? Well, our recommendation is a little vague, purposefully. We say that within that same season, you don't necessarily need to retest. But if there's a high risk exposure after 90 days, the person has to go in quarantine. So there's no get out of jail free card on this. And why do we waffle a little bit? Well, we have emerging data, and it's very interesting data, but we just don't know the absolute validity of it, is that immunity may go on for some time because the tests that have looked at antibodies have been just singular tests. They haven't really looked at it from a multivariant or orthogonal point of view. And so that's very important. That's a severe limitation. And some of the emerging data is that we're seeing robust antibodies at 5, 6, 7 months. We don't know really what that means, but we also know that with PCR testing, sometimes you can test positive beyond that, the 90 days because there may be still viral particles there. So it's all confusing. So what we did is said, look, you don't need to retest in that same season, but we ultimately are leaving it up to the local providers and to the local public health officials. So the group did not feel that they could micromanage that issue because it's just too complex. So I think that addresses, and then the other part of this question, I'm sorry, is if our team is on the road and someone in the travel party tests positive, how do we get them home? Well, we have asked every host site to have an isolation room available. So if someone tests positive on the road, they go into isolation. Then the question is, do they stay there for 10 days? Well, they might, or longer if they get sick with COVID. Or if they are transported, it has to be done in a very specific way. So a private car, a private van, where everyone has proper personal protection equipment. The drivers would have N95 masks, and though the individual infected is clearly separated and also is appropriately masked. I know that some conferences, in particular the Big Ten, the Pac-12, they've hired a third-party company to manage these this sort of situation, but that's money as well. So not everyone can be in that position. The third question: have we considered utilizing contact tracing hardware applications like Connexon in order to be more precise? So we have looked at that data. Here's part of the problem with that data is that. So say the Pac-12 has been looking very carefully at data similar to this, but it's only during practice and competition. And then what happens once they leave that site because they're actually using a different kind of software for that. So it is emerging, and I think it possibly could be helpful, but again, it depends on the contact tracers. They may say, I don't believe this data hasn't been validated, or others might say, well, this is very interesting. So you're actually showing to me that there were only 3 players who had a high-risk exposure in that game or practice or in the last couple of days. So the bottom line is we don't know yet. We're still really looking at the data, but I would say this: if you are using it, be very familiar with it and make certain that the local public health authorities, the contact tracers, know that you are using it, so that your contact tracers working with them that actually do ultimately report to them, they can demonstrate what you have found. This is really emerging information, and so it possibly is useful, but again, I can't stress this enough. The local political decisions ultimately are what, they override everything. Next question: should there be a limit on the number of spectators allowed at games? So this is really tricky. I will say that the advisory panel did weigh in that when we were looking at the multiple teams in one location or multi-team events, they said there shouldn't be more than 25% spectator capacity. And then in the basketball operations document, we actually specified more how they should be. So, but this is not an NCAA decision. This is a local public health decision. So when we put together the US Open, and we were presenting our plans to Governor Cuomo and to Mayor de Blasio, Governor Cuomo was very clear. He loved the plans. In fact, it became the blueprint for all other professional sports in New York State, but he said there will be no fans. Didn't matter what we said, it was what Governor Cuomo said. There are some, as you know, municipalities and states that are encouraging fans and others that are not. So this, again, it's a political decision because everyone's looking at the same science, right? Same medicine, but they interpret it differently. So that's the answer to that question. And so if there are plans to have spectators on site, you need to really work that carefully through with the local and state authorities. And certainly there should be a way that ingress and egress are controlled and that everyone is physically masked. And I'm going to spend just a minute on that. Masking works. There are statements out there to the contrary, but the evidence is overwhelming. And if this country, if we went into universal masking, everyone was physically distancing and masking, we would turn this current third wave around within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Those are sound scientific projections. And other countries have tried to do things differently. Sweden, for example, they said, we're just going to strive for herd immunity and open up the economy. Well, it didn't work in Sweden because their mortality rate was higher than their European neighbors, and their economic success story was not one. In fact, they did not outperform their neighbors, and they never came anywhere near herd immunity. They're way below 20%. And herd immunity, we're talking about not 20%. We're talking a majority of individuals approaching 80%. That's what a vaccine is. The next is, if masks mitigate the spread of COVID-19, why doesn't the NCAA mandate mask wearing in practice and competition, especially since basketball is a high-risk sport? So first, let's talk about high-risk sports. I will tell you that our group, and this isn't pertinent to you all necessarily, but we are reconsidering the transmission risk of sports. Because when we look at football, the entire season to date, let me share with you some data that we have. This is just from the Autonomy 5, the Power 5 conferences. Of their first 6,500 positive COVID-19 cases in their student athletes, some going beyond football, there were 8 hospitalizations with no complications and 9 cases of myocarditis with no complications, a 0.1% rate for both. We have no clear evidence that infection took place while playing football. We also have one game in the NFL where, as it turned out, there were individuals who were positive, but there was no evidence that infection was spread during the game to the opposing team. But what's important about that is that it's outdoors, and even the close contact in football, it's not quite the same as in basketball, because in basketball, the close contact can be much more sustained. It's easily, as you know, the shot clock. And with 2 people being very close to one another during that time, if you're playing, one-on-one, man-to-man defense, woman-to-woman defense, or even in a zone, there's still very close contact. And in football, it's much more short-lived. So that's good news for outdoor sports. Indoor sports are very different because there's what really matters indoors is the ventilation. And so we've been very clear about that. And we do believe that basketball and even ice hockey and certainly wrestling, that their risk of transmission spread is higher. There already was a report now a week ago about a super spreader event at a ice hockey game. So these are different and challenging concerns. So with regard to a mask mandate, I know that some teams are practicing with masks, and it makes a lot of sense. It's difficult, it's challenging. I mean, look, I competed, I played a tennis tournament a couple of weeks ago at the master's level. I can't play in a mask, and I've tried training in it, and you can do it, but it's challenging. And in basketball, if the mask gets wet, it becomes ineffective. And when you're in the lane, the mask gets knocked down and everything, you're constantly touching it and this and that. It's a challenge in basketball. I'm just saying it's a real challenge. But for those teams that are practicing in masks, I think it really makes a lot of sense, because anything you can do, anything to mitigate or to lessen the chance of COVID spread should be done. Again, I will share with you that when we look at football, all of the cases that were positive, they didn't come from football, though. They came from outside of sport, from socializing. So if there's one message I can share with the coaches, that the bond you have with your players, and it's a sacred bond, right? And sport really is something sacred when we think about it. It takes human beings to a level of challenge and decency and spirituality and pushing yourself to the edge of excellence and giving everything that you have, and you're working it's just a common bond in humanity, and it's so much of a recreation of what it means to be human. This is the time that the basketball players and the coaches have this especially sacred bond, because there's not going to be a season if there's rapid and rampant COVID spread. So this isn't just about what's happening on the court, and certainly you do everything you can to mitigate the risk of COVID-19, but this is what the athletes are doing 24/7 beyond what's happening on the court. It's what the coaches are doing 24/7. Quite frankly, there should be an assumption that everyone you interact with has COVID-19. Make that assumption. Now, when you're masked, you're being a good human being because you're caring about others, because that's lessening the chance of you spreading it to others. That's why I don't understand this, the civil liberties idea about masks, because we don't let people walk around and spread arson or something else into the air. I mean, that's a public health issue. So if you have COVID-19, which is a potential lethal bullet, why should you be allowed to spread that in the air? It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, that's the mask issue. Contact tracing issues to test out of quarantine. So I talked about testing out of quarantine. We're really trying to accomplish that. In what ways can we form drills? By sharing balls. And so one thing I will tell you is that we were concerned initially about the vector spread of COVID-19 being surface to hand, but we don't really see that. So we're much, much less concerned about sharing balls. And in our updated document, we will note that. And I will also share with you that don't put disinfectants on balls because it ruins the balls. If you're going to wash the balls, use good old-fashioned soap and water, and that's what the NBA found was the most effective. But we're much less concerned. Yes, you're sharing balls and people should be frequently doing hand sanitization. We shouldn't be touching our face and everything, but we're just not concerned about that as a vector spread. We think the vector spread is respiratory droplet or the aerosolization, where the virus can remain in the air for longer than it takes for just the respiratory particles to drop to the ground. Here's one. Based on the recommendation by the NCAA testing, once a week is acceptable during practice, but when games begin, it's 3 times a week. Yeah, so we already answered that question. So it's that scenario. You're playing one team a week, and even though it's back-to-back games, that testing paradigm is just that once a week PCR. That's done at least 3 days before the last game, the second game, or an antigen test the day of each game. Why won't the NCAA allow student athletes to test out of quarantine? It's not our call. That's the CDC's call, but more importantly, that's the public health authority's call. And so, as I said before, even if we get this data from the CDC that shows we can possibly mathematically predict an exceptionally low probability of developing COVID-19 after days 5, 6, and 7 in quarantine, those tests come back negative. It doesn't mean that every municipality is going to allow one to do that. It's just not our call. We provide the recommendations, and we have them aligned with national, federal recommendations. But again, I can't emphasize enough the local politics of all of this. And then finally, our last question, shifting gears a little bit. As a coach, what specifically should I ask the student athlete that I feel is depressed and not himself or herself? I don't want to ask a generic one, but one that will allow him or her to open up to me so I can get some help. Athletes tend not to ask for help. This is what we need to be able to do so as coaches. Well, I would start before then, and if you haven't already done this, please do this today or tomorrow or the next day. You sit down with your entire team, and ideally with you, you have a licensed mental health provider. Know who that person is on your campus. Know how you can access the licensed mental health provider for your athlete. And again, that's very different than a sports psychologist who's a mental toughness coach. Most sports psychologists are not licensed mental health providers. They're actually kinesiologists. But a licensed mental health provider is anywhere from a psychiatrist to a nurse practitioner to a clinical social worker, to a clinical psychologist, and even primary care physicians who have special training in mental health care. So sit down with that individual, and as a group, you say to them, you know what? Mental health matters. Your mental health matters. And in fact, we have good evidence that athletes have had more depression and anxiety during COVID-19 than their baseline. You let them know that their mental health is as important as an ankle sprain. So certainly if they have an ankle sprain, they get immediate care. Well, if they're feeling depressed, they're feeling anxiety, it's your permission, your attitude that promotes mental wellness, and you have it arranged so that you understand how any athlete can get help. So as a coach, you don't need to necessarily ask the specific question. What the athlete is going to understand, especially if you've been preemptive about this, is that mental health matters. It's okay not to be okay. You've given the permission at the front end. And if you notice something, you say, you know, hey, Mary, hey, John, just don't seem yourself. Is there anything we can do to help? Anything I can do to help? But your job isn't to console. Your job is to do the handoff. But that is an enormous thing. And then we also have really good data. And I'm going to end with this because it's one of the favorite pieces of data I have found, is that one of the most important things a coach can do with regard to mental health is to teach an athlete how to develop self-compassion. Promote self-compassion. And with that, and on that very positive note, I'm going to end and from these questions, and really thank you for the very thoughtful questions. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to be with you. And I'll also, well, let me end on another positive note. I am really confident we are going to have March Madness and Final Four. We understand now much more than we did back in March of 2020. And so, yeah, let's end on that note of confidence. So thank you.
Dr. Hainline, thank you so much for that presentation, especially the final question, because that's something that we've really focused on during this summit. I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us. Thanks also for your kind words about coaches at the beginning. It really means a lot to all of us. And on behalf of those coaches everywhere, thank you for your tireless efforts to help us remain safe and return to the game we all love. And our viewers, thank you for joining us this week for the NABC Fall Summit. Remember that each session will be available on demand here in the virtual attendee hub for the next 90 days. And to help us continue to grow events like this in the future, please take a moment to fill out the survey. Thank you again.